All right, so let's see here. Man, we had a great conversation, and I know we talked about many different subjects. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of anchor, encompass ourselves to the real for this is that well be the compass or the how would you say it like the bridge of the conversation. So I think just kind of going back to and just to remember like I guess what would be the cultural significance of the real Salado to the community? Like when you think about the history and like the cultural significance to the real Salado and the narratives to the different demographics here in South Phoenix, Central City South, on the South Central Corridor. And I think we touched a little bit about the last time, but maybe some things that we didn't cover, but just some things that you
Well,
think that's important for
it's hard
people
to
to know.
say the cultural significance. I mean, it's there, you know, and it's what formed this whole area. All of it comes from this river. And I know when I was a young boy, it was dry, and and I used to walk around wondering why is this place here. I didn't realize there were 6 dams holding back the water. And when I talked to people who grew up here, the older people, a little older than I am, you know, they talk about the river flowing. Like I talked to people in Tempe, yeah, we used to go to the swimming holes there, or talk to people in like in the Golden Gate area. Yeah, we go down to the river. It was always flowing, you know. So, but it was important to them, and it seems like we talked about how South Phoenix was separate because it was, even though it was a river, it was also a barrier, you know. And we talked a little bit last time about Dwight Hurd.
Yeah.
And Dwight Hurd came in with a lot of money from the East Coast. He had a lot of connections. But when you had those floods in 1891 and 1905, the most attractive areas for the valley were north of Washington Street. And then you start having a further divide, a cultural divide there. Okay. Here you have a physical divide, the south, and then you have a cultural divide or a racial divide or a racist divide, whatever you want to call it, in the northern area, because those areas, their real estate holdings were good. And those people, I mean, I've read some studies where people talked about the areas in that area of a society that's basically a hermetically sealed society. In other words, they were in there in their own little world. They created their own style. They not realizing that they were dependent on all these other people to keep the whole social structure, the economy going, providing the necessity for their good life.
Right.
Yeah. So culturally, I think even though it's a very important thing, it's been a divide. It's a, it has, South Phoenix, as opposed to North Phoenix, where there were nicer areas, where you had in Cano Park, where they used to run the Chicanos off if they showed up in that
That's
area.
right, right. They had an amphitheater there too. Remember?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I remember my
The
dad used to take me there.
like a miniature Hollywood Bowl.
Yeah, I remember that. And then I think just like the cultural significance and also just like the generations is like, I always remembered, I always heard like, the river bottom. They always call it the river bottom. And they got that name because of the industrialization and being used as the backyard dump, and like, and I think, culturally how that was, in a sense, the community, it was, I want to say it was embraced, but it was also like, it was the reality and how community is like positive and like, hey, this is what we got. We're gonna make the best of it. And so, like, how do you remember back then and how the Salt River, the river bottom, and how the community interacted with it? Like I heard that there was people that throw little parties or they would get together, have some beer, but how that was used as a community space, a third space, you know.
Well, I've heard of that, but I never did it myself.
Right.
You know. You know, the river bottom. It was basically a scar across the city.
Mhm.
You know, because this stuff here, no, it wasn't here. There was no water that was brought up to create this water space that used to exist before, you had all those dams put up there.
Right.
You know, I mean, it was so divided. I remember, uh, I think it was about 1965. For the first time, I saw the river raging through town. Central Avenue Bridge. That was it. That meant that the whole area was cut off. In the 70s, the same thing. In the 80s, the same thing. Got to the point where the freeway was already in, but the bridge was knocked out. The foundations weren't right. So the only crossings were the Mill Avenue Bridge and the
Oh, wow.
Central Avenue Bridge.
Wow. That's a big gap for a
big gap, which meant before it wasn't that big a deal, but as the city grew and as this area was absorbed by the city of Phoenix, you couldn't have that continue. That's why you have all these bridges across the river now. They weren't there before. The river, while it was the lifeblood of the valley, was a great divide. Right. I know I had an aunt and uncle that lived right here on Elwood, just off of Central Avenue. Mm-hmm. And you talk about being separate, that meant that you had few services. I know that one of my cousins put a trailer on one of the lots, but we had to dig out the septic tank because there were no sewers. And my dad worked for the water department. I remember him working on a water main right there along Elwood, part of the city services. So when you talk about, making a gateway into South Phoenix, it's been somewhat of an isolated place. Yeah. But that's changing. Right. Yeah. And you don't have as many areas that are completely segregated like before.
So when you talk about change, how do you feel, and I know it's always a double-edged sword with certain development, the light rail, other projects that are happening here. From your experience, and I know that sometimes our community can be a little bit, resistant to change, and sometimes that can work for us or against us. With all the development coming, like the light rail and all that, how do you see, like, how should our community embrace that, or how do you see how that can be influential, or how can we leverage investment and change versus fearing it? Like, from your experience and like the future, how do you feel about?
It's now you're talking about a very difficult situation. We're in a society that was used to having a lot of land to expand into. Now you're having the pressures coming in, so the land is becoming more valuable. And then these improvements make the land even more valuable. And some people say, that's great, that's gentrification. But what happens to all the people who live there, who have grown up here, who have connections, the family connections and all that? What happens to them if they can no longer afford it? Now, that's a big issue. And I'm certain that's one of the main, aside from the businesses along Central Avenue, that's one of the main issues. I mean, what happens when you bring this in? The land, because you know that whether it's next to freeways or next to, improvements like the light rail, that's going to encourage investments. More money. When you hit more money in there, it starts putting pressures on those who don't have as much money. And, the solution is going to have to come from the people. Right. Because, people in power, they may say they're interested, but are they really? One thing about politics, if you have sufficient wherewithal, you can make people listen to you. but then that takes a sense of identity of where you are, takes a sense of the importance of this place that I live in. Because often what happens is, you get tired of seeing what's going on around you. It's changing. The close relationships are being, ripped apart.
Right.
And so what do? You look for some place that's not so bad. Yeah. And things can turn that way. What struck me is that I was looking at things, so, as I do from time to time, and you find that the South Phoenix has a reputation for being a place to be careful, be afraid of, but the crime rate's the same here as in other parts of the city. So what's the difference? The fear factor. And when development comes in, along Baseline Road, what do you have? Gated communities. Kind of like in Latin America, huh?
That's true. The gated communities always is like that.
Yeah, so they're protected from the fear that's out there. And, that means they're isolated from everybody else.
Right.
I mean, and I guess that's the danger of having a city so spread out like we have here.
Right.
As it becomes clear that moving further and further out is not an answer, not a solution. It takes you an hour to get to work. You spend more than a day of work just getting to work.
Yeah.
If you look
Right.
at over the course of the week.
Yeah.
And so these areas are becoming more and more, desired.
Right. And I think we touched base the last time a little bit about like growing up in the 70s and 80s and the significance of murals and how they were a conduit and the voice of the communities of social issues, and even up to this day, like art has always still is significant from if it's political campaigns or for whatever, and corporations use art to sell or to divert people to a certain way of thinking. How important do you think and how it's been impacted from the 70s, 80s until now, like for our community, for murals to speak about our cultural identity and to also show that we're still here and that our cultural identity is here? Like, how
It's
important
more than just that we're still here. It's like we're here. There's a different perspective. Prior to that time that you're talking, I remember in the 60s, I'd read articles like Time came out, the invisible minority or the forgotten minority. They're talking about Chicanos. You know, we're not part of the overall society because the segregation. And Phoenix was a very, very segregated city. And so what you see is it in school? No, it was never in school. The story here. The only thing you heard about was, well, there was a Mexican War, and we won. And then you move on. Where did you hear about Chicanos anywhere? You didn't.
Right.
So what do you have? You have no, organized way of conveying why you're here. I mean,
Right.
you're here, but why? Where do you fit in? How do you fit in? There was nothing in the schools. I mean, that's the reason why I went into history, because my dad was being from New Mexico. They know their history over there. He'd tell me about, history. And I read and read, there was no Mexicans. When they were so not thought about that, products would base it on caricatures of Mexicans. The Frito Bandido, right? I had a cousin who was just outraged that the Arizona bank, I forget what bank it is now because they all have been taken over. They used to have a commercial about Mexicans being all sweaty with bandoleros and all that, basically talking about, what a tough bank it was to bust.
Oh, wow.
They didn't think anything of it, right? And so when you talk about art, art is a means of communication. If it wasn't, you wouldn't do it. You know, why would you bother? Just for yourself? No, it's to say something, to convey something, right? So that's what was starting to happen in the 70s, because in that period you start having the Chicano movement. But where's the story, and how do people know about it? Huh? And so now you start having public art, and public art is the way you convey things to people. You know? And so, how do you convey a message of what's really going on, or how you feel about things, or look at this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? It's a means of making that connection with your audience. Now, I hear some artists want to say, "Hey, it doesn't matter," right? They say, "Yeah, it's out there for people to make their own interpretations." Well, there's some, but murals aren't that. Murals are conveying a story, right? At least the ones I've seen. And areas where it's very vibrant, you see these murals all over the place. Look at Roosevelt Road. What do they do there? They're making murals. What? Right. To convey a sense of place, right? Place where no one wanted to go to just a few years ago.
Yeah. Now all the developers and all the lofts and everybody came.
Again, because the people are concentrating more. It's becoming inconvenient to live so far out.
Right. Yeah, I always talked about how the muralists, the artists, are the first developers on the scene to create what you would say the visual flowers for people that are like, oh, this place is nice. We should, and this, it attracts developers, to that. And at the end of the day, the artists themselves end up not being able to afford to be at that place where they cultivate it. So it's almost like the farmers who get to farm and grow the fruit, but they don't get to eat from the fruit. They just grow it. And I always kind of compare the farmer to the artist when it comes to places like Roosevelt. And they just recently, a place called Pemberton displaced a lot of artists and small businesses out of nowhere. They only had 2 weeks to say, hey, the property sold. But that place was vibrant. They had all these small restaurants and everything. And then, so once again, so being careful in how artists are used as a tool is also something important that we always try to do, but also to let them know that artists have families too. They're not just artists wilding out, weird, drinking and smoking, like the stereotype that these artists are like educators, they're fathers, they're mothers, they're like healers, and that art needs to be looked at as part of that bigger framework of building a city. Like without the artists and the education and the healers, like, what do you have? So how do you see how art, from your perspective, and how art can heal, and education and art together, how that helps community heal or individuals heal? How did that help you heal from just like seeing your cultural identity, and how that helped you to be an educator? Like how that triggered you to like, yeah, I'm proud.
That's a good question. Again, I graduated from high school in '61, so there was no art. My art, and I'm colorblind.
Mm.
Okay, and so art. There's the visual arts, all kinds of art. To me, my art was history. To create, not to create, but extract stories and distill them in a way that I could see it. Mm. Mm. So that was my art. But I also know that I was driven in that way. Perhaps it was my upbringing. Perhaps it was my dad saying, "Don't bring me anything less than a B."
Right.
It could have been that forced me to pay enough attention so that I would do well And then later, when I really wanted to know, I went after it. Okay. But what you're talking about is the kind of art that opens the world, opens the possibilities. You see, that's a different sort of, I was talking about when I came up,
Right.
you know, when I came up and I saw the art, I knew what it was saying because that's what I'd been studying. But I can imagine what it's like to somebody who sees something and says, "Oh, I've seen that before. That's pretty cool. What's he trying to do here?" Maybe open up the questioning or open up the curiosity that allows you to expand your vision of things and in turn interact and expand the visions of others with you. In other words, social cultural communication. Yeah.
Mm.
I don't know if that's making sense,
No,
but
that makes a lot of sense. And so there was a thing I posted, I seen on Instagram yesterday, that AZ Central put out. It's this bill that Arizona's doing, or Phoenix, to make low riding basically a crime or illegal. And there's been a lot of resurgence of the lowrider community in a positive way, where the system or certain systems are still looking at the stereotype of, oh, they're gangsters, they're drug dealers, they're no good. And like a lot of the events now that you see, it's like you may see somebody that like you were portray or stereotype because they're tattooed or however they dress and all that, but these people work for the city, they're firemen, they're like fathers, they're like they're contributing to society. And I seen that pivot, but like when the whole thing of like low riding, as I always looked at it, it's like, it's art on wheels, it's engineering. There's a lot of architecture. There's all kinds of aspects. There's design. And so like from your perspective and like, just the whole reflection of low riding and how it's culturally super relevant of the blanket of Chicano culture. But like, growing up in the 70s and 80s and South Central being, known for low riding. And then also, I believe we were the first ones who had the first lowrider show at Thunderbird Park, um, which was off by the reservation. So, anyways, like just like when we think about lowriding community, the lowrider community, and the art and the culture of it, like how that's interweaved with community and also part of like our identity. You know what I mean? In a sense, when it comes to engineering.
low riders are artists. And more than just, I mean, they're creating. They find people who can paint that if they're not good painters. They engineer their vehicles. Have you seen a poor lowrider? That's expensive stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So, and they're not drug dealers. Well, maybe one or two, but overall,
Right.
yeah, they have their jobs, their families, and it's a form of art. It's on wheels.
Yeah. Right.
So, but if that's the case, um, I had read that they're trying to protect it. Others are trying to get rid of it.
Right.
Give it up, folks.
Right.
It's not going to go away. Not,
Yeah.
right away.
It's actually just got bigger and bigger. And so like they're talking about, creating the city, creating a space and investing in a space or a park or an area where it is, dedicated to low riding, but not only low riding, but other cars, so make it like there's a car culture out there. Why does low riding always get the bad rap? Well, we have people out there drag racing and these other cars, like, you know what I mean? Like, and it's like, but still, it's like there's also part of that racism through culture identity, and since sometimes it's still sneaking in there.
Yeah, but art transcends.
Right.
In the 50s, nobody wanted. Well, I wouldn't say nobody.
Right.
But a lot of people didn't want black music. I venture to say right now it's dominant, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What is it? It's art. So I'm not too concerned about the future of lowriders.
Right.
Not on like, I don't care about it. No, I'm not concerned about it because it's an art, it's a personal expression, you know. And if you have areas where people come and see them, others start saying, "Hey, that's cool. I can do this," or maybe that's what happens with art.
Right. I mean, we got the Phoenix Suns has their own Phoenix Suns lowrider now.
Yeah.
It came a long way from, from it being like, now it's like, hey,
And is that going to help transcend into a wider acceptance? Of course, that's going to make it more expensive because not everyone's going to want the kind of car that you can turn into a lowrider.
Right.
I'm a little older now, so I got rid of I had a 72 Chevelle, and everyone was trying to buy it off of me. You know,
Right.
so yeah, I think it's just going to expand
Right. Right.
as long as the city is a car cultural city, and that's what it is right now. It may change. The light rail is an indication that it is because
Right.
It's pretty expensive to maintain a car.
Yeah, it is. And so, like, talking about significant areas in like in the 70s and 80s around the real Salado, I remember my mom, my dad. My dad he used to play guitar. He was in a group called Cosmos Ochenta, and he used to play here at the Crystal Palace or Crystal, what is it? The Crystal Palace Ballroom here, and then there was Riverside.
Yeah.
So those are the places where Raza gathered and partied, and the bands and stuff. That was kind of like our little entertainment. It was almost like an entertainment district because of the two main places. Do you remember those places or like?
Well, I bet I went to the Riverside a few times.
Yeah.
But the culture is always changing.
Right.
You know, in my situation, uh, my dad came back from the war, a changed person. You know, he had been in battle. He was a prisoner of war. Came back, and he wasn't going to let the society hold him back. You know, so I ended up growing up not in a rich neighborhood, but in an integrated neighborhood. Poor whites, blacks, Chicanos, Chinese, the store,
Yeah.
you know, and I had all these friends, different kinds of friends. So I could go here or there, wherever I wanted to go.
Right.
So I would not be truthful if I said that I grew up through high school in Avadia, because I didn't. And but I do remember when people were telling me not to speak Spanish, And in order to survive, I did speak Spanish for quite a while. I always understood it, and But the interesting thing is that the society wants you to be a certain way. You got to be all American, only English only, that sort of stuff. Well, what's the first question I was asked when I went for a job?
What's your nationality?
No. Can you speak Spanish? Because that's how you make your money. So I know one thing, as the economy goes, so does culture and everything else. Because think about it. Why do we have certain cultural traits? That's how we survive. That's how we earn our living. Right? But as that changes, the culture changes. And the question is, how do we transition into a society that's accepting, that allows you to be yourself and yet be part of, because you don't want to be separated from.
Right.
That's a major question right now, because the reality is no one knows where they're going. You got a whole school system that appears to be determined to self-segregate. and you can see it in the schools, you know. And the problem with that is that some schools are being impoverished to make that other possible, that separate thing. And, and that is a political issue because education is a political act. Now, we got a lot of issues here, and I think it's important to hold on to things that are important, traditions. But we also have to be aware of what in our traditions are injurious to ourselves and change our lives accordingly. You know, that comes to all kinds of things. And I didn't think that up. That came from Albert Einstein. And the interesting thing is that he was talking about a time when the atom bomb came into being, cultural traditions, war, that sort of stuff. We have to change because now we can destroy ourselves. What in the culture is beautiful, and you keep it and you wear it. You know, if other people don't like it, well, you got to be able to say, I don't care, because you have to be who you are. But what is it that holds you back? I'm not saying anything in particular. I'm talking about an individual person as they try to make their way through this life that's just changing so dramatically. You know, how do you convey, what's important and what's going on in the world? Well, that's where art is, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a conduit.
Yeah, it's a conduit for not only what has been, what's beautiful about it, why it's so important now, but where do you go? How do we go?
Like painting the future through
Yeah,
the art.
yeah. Art is important. It's important to have that mythology that it makes you be part of something. And people make the mistake of thinking of myth and mythology as something, like Aesop's fables or something like that. No, mythology is our shared story. You have your story, I have mine, those people over there have theirs. But as long as we have some sort of a shared story, we can deal with each other. That was the problem for Chicanos, not part of the shared story. That's why that art was important. Huh? That's why I dare say historians are important.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so through art, like when we talk about different cultures and how we embrace each other, like you're saying, you know, uh, black music is dominant in America. It's the fabric of America, and even in Chicano culture, all the, when we say we listen to oldies, a lot of the oldies are, they're black artists. So we embrace it in a sense right there, right in front of us. We listen to it spiritually, listening to it. And so like the importance of like knowing other people's history too, like knowing other people's history is also just as important as knowing our history because it helps us to understand and to create that
It's
conduit.
our shared story, our myth, right?
Yes.
What joins us together? How we share our story so that we recognize each other in it.
Right.
Yeah. Shouldn't be surprising about the impact of black culture in our society. The truth is, they provided the bulk of the labor to build that society on the East Coast. I think it was only John Adams who wasn't a slaveholder. You know, New York, the person who was a major stockholder in the Royal Africa Company became King James II.
Right.
He made his money off slavery, used them to build New York and all up and down the coast. The Black story is a very critical part of American history. That's true. The Chicano, the Mexicano story is a critical part of American history. It's Mexican labor that integrated the former Mexican territories into the American economic structure. Think about it. What do you see out in the fields now? Who'd you see 50 years ago? Who do you see doing the hard labor construction now? Who did it 100 years ago? You know? So, that story is very, very important as part of creating our world that is today, that will be tomorrow, that we can live in peace with each other. Because what's the alternative? If you don't share with somebody else and you see yourself as poor, what's the future of our society?
Right. And you touched on something last time about, the real Salado and the connection to the canals and the indigenous heritage that's here. Um, the original people, and how that was like in the 70s, 80s, 60s. That, and I think we talked about Tempe being like the main hub where everything kind of went and connected to everything. How was the connection from Tempe to South Phoenix, Central City, South Central, where we're at? What was that like, and how did that start, or how did that kind of?
You mean the Mexicano movement into this area? Okay, the first thing is understand that all of this is built on the backs of the engineering skills of the people who had been here before. And those people, by the way, were connected with central Mexico, because we have all those extended things. So there's always been that cultural geographical connection here. That engineering feat here was also part of what we saw in northern Mexico and in the desert areas. And you see it in all desert areas. Like the Mexicanos, a lot of their water laws come from Spain because you had irrigation there too. So when you get to Tempe and people see that there were canals before, do the Mexicanos know what to do with it? Of course they do. They know how to lay out canals so it's great. You don't need an engineering degree if you have the skill to lay it out. So they were laying this out. When the United States comes in here and takes over northern Sonora, which is this place, okay, Mexico was in a period of conflict. It had been since independence. You see, it was Mexican independence was an unfinished civil war, so the conflict continued. That destroyed the central viability of the Mexican nation as a major political force. Right. So, which means that while you had that very powerful cultural force, and it was, that had developed a commercial connections, engineering connections that were basically what allowed the development of this area to take place. All of it, the freighting, the irrigation, the farming, the cattle raising, sheep herding, all of that stuff. But it was fit to the environment before the Industrial Revolution. So it shouldn't be surprising that when the United States takes over, Mexico's still in civil war. Not here, over there. And where are you going to get the people to make this place feasible? Who are the miners? Where are the miners from? Centuries of experience in Mexico. First thing you do, you import them in, right? Civil War in Mexico, where are you going to go? It's still the same culturally.
Right.
It's still the same place, you know. So, and then you had the reality that the Athabascan people, especially the Apaches, were mortal enemies of the Mexicanos and vice versa. Brutal. And the Odam, what we call the Pimas and the Papagos, we used to call them, they were mortal enemies of the Apaches. And they were also irrigators, weren't they? You see this sort of settled process. So they're part of this whole thing. So what you're going to have is American agents, including military people, have treaties with the Apaches to leave them alone. And the Apaches would be raiding northern Mexico. So what happens? The Sonorenses come over here, and they're moving up the river valleys. In the 1850s, before there was a Homestead Act or anything like that, they're moving into this region. Yeah. Like I told you before, I interviewed a person over in Wickenburg whose family set themselves up in 1857. Are they waiting for the American Army? No, they're not.
Right.
They've been frontier people for a long time. So they're moving up here. In the early 1860s, they're showing up in this place here where you can ford the Salt River, Tempe Buttes, right? And so when they show up, they start working with the canals. When the Americans are coming in also, the business people, they, coordinate with the Mexicanos to build these canals. And so if you look at the south side of the river, right in that area of Tempe is where a lot of canals are coming out, and the same place to the north, right? And so you have what they call the Mexican Ditch, the San Francisco Canal, you understand? And these people are basically settling in there. And so you have all these Mexicanos here. When they talk about the history of South Phoenix, they say Broadway Road was because the fellow by the name of Broadway had a ranch. And then you read the history, and he's the first one. Oh, there were a few Mexicans, you understand?
Yeah.
But they were all part of that movement across here, setting up agriculture south of the river, south into this area here. Okay? And so that's what you have. Of course, you have a clash with the legal structures of the Americans and the deeds and all this other stuff. Dispossession took place with a lot of people, but still some Mexicanos kept their lands, And then you have the Mexican Revolution in 1915, 1910, 1915. Disruption again. At the same time, you have the Salt River Project come in at the same time, which means industrial agriculture. You need workers. Where are you going to get them? And the railroads have gone into northern Mexico and Arizona at the same time. Who's going to build the railroads? Who's going to maintain the railroads? And once you get them there, that's going to make the mines possible? Who's going to basically be the bulk of the mining population? Mexicanos. Salt River, who's going to be the bulk of the farm workers? Mexicanos. They're the underlying basis of the economic structure of this area, and always have been.
Talking about the railroads, and I just couldn't help but think about the symbology of the light rail. And in some people's eyes, it's an investment. In other people's eyes, it's disruptive. It's a double-edged sword, what we say. And when I'm hearing you speak about the railroads, it's like, where are we going to get the workers from? You gotta rail them in. You gotta bring them in. And I think right now where South Phoenix is at with this project, and some businesses are hurting, some business won't be here. What does that look like? And what does that investment look like? But right now, as it is right now, we would just say that there's really no real investment coming into South Phoenix, that the light rail is more used symbolically as another railroad to bring and to take all the labor from South Phoenix outwards to Tempe to work. Once again, we need the workforce. So, and and that's just like what I'm thinking or what I'm seeing, because I haven't really seen real investment in South Phoenix to say, hey, we're investing in the community. The light rail is one thing. That's transportation system. That's just overall overarching. Where's our other investment? Where's our own hospital? Where's our own movie theater? Where's our own all these things that we don't still have that north of the river still has? So it's just like one of those things that sometimes history repeats itself, and if we're not careful, and if we're not using our voice and using our cultural identity for economic development, we're going to be just repeating. And so, I think when we get development on this area, it's like if we're not driving it, it's going to by default.
It's going to follow, the money's going to follow. The powers that be will bring the money in to suit what they want.
Mm.
But the light rail is a public.
Yes.
That means politics. Okay. There were a lot of people that wanted that, otherwise it wouldn't be there. And not so much those people over there. It was I'm sure that there were people, some movers and shakers, I don't know who they are,
Mm-hmm.
who were pushing for this because it would be a service where people could get to their jobs, like you were saying. Now the need for theaters or the right kind of industry. It's a political economic structure, you see. And you have to have a sense of community to demand things for the community. And not just one guy yelling up here, we need this, which means, to me, political organization to get people to express their voice, to force these people to produce what you need for the community to make it a better place. Of course, the problem becomes if it becomes too nice, people want to move here, which of course then leads us to higher.
Mm-hmm. And I know that there's people that I've talked to that are from South Phoenix. They own businesses, they own property here, and they're like, we worked really hard and paid our house off. We own a business here, and we also too want to see our property value go up.
Right.
For our investment and for us to retire or even to pass down to create generational wealth, which is always use the word generational wealth and how it's accumulated, how it's processed, or however the approach can be very double-edged sword too when you're talking about public spaces and overall arching community that might not have the opportunity to create that generational wealth because they can't own property. They don't own a business, but they're renters and they've been here generationally renting for the last 2-3 generational renters here. So it's that double-edged sword. It's like we want our property values to go up, but not with sacrificing community. And that's really hard to do. How do you do that? As a property owner, I'm not a property owner, but somebody that owns property, like, hey, my property went from X amount to X amount, and like, that's what I invested in. So anyway, that's a hard conversation to have with those who could and those who can't. And how do we leverage that? And I think you hit it on the button the last time, is through education.
Well, oh yes. Education is the way that you access the economic salvation, you want to say it. Like I told you before, I got this from a professor who was talking about cultural history and the transition from a religious centered society to one like we have now.
Right.
Regardless of what people say,
Right.
This is an economic society which allows us to be of different persuasions and still live together. You see? So now I'm losing my train of thought.
No, no, no. It's a lot there too.
Yeah, because I took off in another direction. No, but he was saying that. I got it. What you need to understand is that while you had religious salvation, I was raised Catholic.
Right.
You go through the sacraments, whether it's baptism, confirmation, Holy Communion, you know. Well, the milestones in the secular salvation, what? Graduate from 8th grade, high school diploma, college diploma, you see. And so your salvation religiously are the sacraments in the Catholic world. In our economic structure, it's those credentials that you gather. And if you have an inadequate education structure, you lose 75% of your potential. I'm just expressing what I've seen. Not that I haven't. You lose 75% of your potential to create the wealth for yourself and then those around you, for your family, to create that generational wealth. See? And I always say, education is a political act. You have to have the political will to make sure that the young have what they need to become productive and participatory members of society. And then enjoy the society around you, you know?
Right.
See?
And I think with that, like we have like education, we have, you know, our family values. I'm thinking about like how we, you know, we're in the desert, we're here at the Rio, we're like, how do we, the responsibility of being good stewards to the land. And and I heard that the Rio Salado, you know, with the CMEX that was over there, um, and how some of the best gravel in the world is here, and how that's been excavated and basically taken to around the world for other places to build community. And it's like, you know, we have the resources here, and it's like why South Phoenix, Central City South, and these areas, we're not able to bear that fruit from this gravel to build our community, but somewhere around everywhere else except here is benefiting. So it's just like how we're not, you know, how do we get control more of our resources? But
Politics, outrage, in a political fashion. You know, it reminds me of what we just went through in Mojave County. Deals swung to extract the water. Basically, it's the wealth and the future of that area. Outrage, he started to put a stop to it, right? And how it's done has to come from the people themselves.
Right.
You know, I'm a historian. I'm not a
Yeah.
political developer, you know.
Right.
But you know, if you feel confident enough and you understand the structure enough, you can make that structure respond to your needs. You know, I'm not saying to your desires, because that's unending, right?
Yeah. Right.
But to your needs. And you know, that's the river bottom. You know, that belongs to all of us, doesn't it?
Nobody owns it. Everybody owns it in a sense, you know?
Yeah. And so how do you use that? Well, you lease it. Who do you lease it from? Where does that authority come from? You know, that's for somebody to do the research, to find out, to notify people. make the connections. Of course, that takes people who've been educated in that process or who have been educated by people who understand this process. Because you don't need a PhD to mobilize for the needs of a community, but you do need access to the knowledge that allows you to do that.
Tools. Good stuff, brother.
I don't know, we're just talking.
I know. That's why I said we will need to do a weekly podcast of just, you know what I mean, and like having you speak with others too, and just like, I mean, there's so much, and it's like it's the education part, and like these type of conversations are, to be shared with people when we're long gone is important, because you know what I mean. If nobody's hearing it, seeing it, or writing it, or it's on the wall to pivot somebody's mind, like, and ask a question, then it gets lost in the sauce, and we end up getting buried again. And so we have to try to avoid that, especially now at this day and age of technology and AI. It's what does that look like for culture, for our culture? Like, how does AI help? How does AI going to uplift and strengthen Chicano, Mexican, indigenous culture, or is it like a Terminator and it's there to destroy us eventually? Like, how does that?
It's a transitioner.
Right.
You know, I mean, did mariachi music come from the Aztecs? Did it come from the Spaniards?
Right. Right.
It's just a transitional process, but it's considered part of the culture. Huh?
Right.
There'll be more transitions coming.
Yeah.
I mean, I still like it.
Right.
you know,
Right.
but I know there's changes coming.
Right.
And we blame AI right now, but that's all because that's all we see right now. But and that in itself is going to drastically transform how education
Oh yeah.
is
It
delivered.
really is.
Oh yeah, it is. But
Dramatically.
the other part of education is not just to gather knowledge, is to have socialize people so they're dealing with others. You know, like I told you, I was brought up in an integrated school. You know? You can see who's smart and who isn't, and that resides in everybody. You know, not just me, not just you.
Right.
You know, it's it's where you get a vision of the world, and that's what education is supposed to provide. A vision of the world so that you can make the appropriate decisions as you go through it for yourself and for those around you that are important to you. And if you have a social consciousness, everybody.
Gotcha.
Because there are various levels of this, you understand?
Right. 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 Yeah, it's almost like a classroom is a microcosm of society's fabric. In that classroom, what do you have? You're going to have the person great in math. You're going to have the strength. You're going to have the healer, the jokester, and the athlete. Yeah. So every classroom has like a microcosm, you can say, if like, and but those classrooms are changing with AI and just the investment in education itself in America. Like, where is that going? I think you mentioned about that going into more private sector. You know, people want to get their kids more into a private sector to ensure that they're getting the education and the skill sets versus in public.
And one other thing, they're afraid of the others. You know, and I'm convinced that's part of it. You know.
Yeah.
But you can't be afraid of the majority.
Yeah.
What does that do to your
Right.
society?
Exactly. Can't run from the sun. It's like it's gonna shine either way, and you can get in the shade, but either way, it's gonna shine. And I think that's kind of like our community and our culture. That light that it brings, and the resiliency and done through compassion, not through violence, just compassionately resisting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The thing that strikes me is we're allowing technology to isolate ourselves, to making ourselves like little islands that just happen to float around but not part of a cohesive whole. And it's the scary part. It seems to be self-imposed.
Yeah.
You know, people focused on this little thing here instead of being gregarious with others.
Right.
And seems to me that at this stage, as I see it at this point, school is the only place where you can have this sort of thing, this more gregarious sort of existence take root.
Right.
I mean, you of course you have family, but then family is a reflection of you.
Right.
Right. So.
So one more thing, or one last thing. So
make sure you talk to Norma Munoz about
yeah,
this.
I was. I'm gonna be reaching out to her later today or tomorrow.
Yeah, she'll probably be the start of your journey.
Yeah.
But remember, education is political act.
Yeah. And one more thing, what do you see the importance of? I think when we're talking about how the digital AI and all that has isolated us, in a sense, in this world on our phones and whatnot, the importance of like public spaces where families can go and gather, and there's music, there's art, there's food, and like
It's happening.
yeah,
You look at cities. Where do they start? We society as a whole fell in love with a car. Look at Phoenix.
great city.
It's in love with a car. And I think what you're starting to find is people the central cities are starting to become more pedestrian friendly, and you're finding areas, and it's going to happen here too. Yeah. But when you look at, and the city still has to have a sense of itself, Phoenix,
Right.
because it exploded after World War II. I mean, this is not the same place. Right. And what was that based upon? Cheap land. And how do you get to your cheap land? In your car. And let's say that you come from could be Michoacan or Michigan, right, or Montana, it doesn't matter, huh? You come to Phoenix. Do you know anybody? All your family? Are they here or are they over there? And so what do? You get in your car. You go to work. You come back. And in many cases, what you do is it's hot outside, you stay in your air-conditioned house. Some people, you want your privacy, you build a fence. So what do you have? Maybe you know a few people at work, but where's that community where people walk around and talk to each other? I mean, this place we call Phoenix was built around the car. What's the future going to be? Because it's getting pretty expensive to own a car. Yeah, you're going to have to be rich to be a lowrider pretty soon.
Right, right. No, that's interesting, and I think with the light rail and the cross section here of the rail and the light rail, you know what I mean? I would say it's like the compass of the city, and like what happens here in the narrative, and how people get involved, is important for the future. So it's hard under doing that in a environment and society that is under pressure. How are you going to pay the rent, bills, sickness?
Right.
And
And so where do you get the salvation to be able to do that?
Yeah.
And the difference here is that here in some of the old barrio areas, you have generations of people here. Other parts of the city, it's a aggregate of strangers,
Right.
There's some cultural or structural opportunities that are here as opposed to other parts of the city. And more you're starting to find out that people were actually born here.
Right.
And so you know, and you have this recognized demographic transformation that's taking place. It's scaring the hell out of people. They're trying to pass laws to stop them from coming, but it's too late, folks. Yeah, it's always been too late. Yeah, because this whole area has been based on cheap labor. They don't like unions here, right? And where's the cheap labor? Uh, Great city. Well, has the potential to be a great city. I don't know if I'll see it, but
Right. Right. Well, yeah. Uh, you know, the potential to be a great city, to be led by great community and culture, there's the disconnect. And when cities, systems, and governments are not, you know,
have a sense of place
yeah,
and self worth.
right. And listening to community experts that are cultural experts that are right there. They're like, those are your best consultants and urban planners that you can, you know, hire, and they're there. They're in the backyard, and a lot of times, uh, systems will hire somebody from some other state to come to consult people in leadership about their own backyard community. And most of the time, those people who get hired are looking for the community experts.
That's right.
So it's like just
They
avoid the
have to
middle.
hire community consultants or
Yeah,
community engagement
right.
people
Yeah,
to deal with what they are hired to do when
right.
they should have been local in the first place.
Exactly. So there's a lot of money that's being lost there, but there's an economic development there that the city should look at. And until we change that, and it's changing a little bit, but still, there's still a long way to go. And you know, sometimes they just overlook their own people in their own backyard. And
Sure, they do, and they accept explanations. I used to be in the South Mountain Village Planning and Zoning Committee.
yeah, yeah,
In that area on the other side of the river, they wanted to establish an industrial place. This is when the bridges were, and we were saying, well, why don't you have that economic opportunity here? Well, it's for the benefit of all those people. But when there's a flood, we have to be able to maintain. And
yeah,
we say that's the point, isn't it?
right,
You know,
right, wow,
you know, people come from outside and they expect their explanations to make sense to those people, or they can bamboozle them into thinking in certain ways. But
right,
it doesn't have to be.
right, right, right. Good.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we can be here for hours, brother. I don't know if your batteries are gonna last right there.